Be continuing in chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. So if you have your Bible, please open to Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. The title of this morning's staff devotional message is Israel and the Wrath of Satan. And as we've been discussing in the book of Revelation during the tribulation period, Israel will be there, but the church will not. The church, of course, as we talked about before, is raptured up before the tribulation period, and we saw that actually at the beginning of chapter 12 with the child that was born. That's not actually Jesus, just like the woman is not Mary. The woman represents Israel, and the beast represents satanic government with, of course, Satan reigning as the head. And then the child represents actually the church with Christ as the head. And so we saw the child being taken up into the presence of God to escape the dragon. And that represents the church being taken out before the dragon has a chance to attack it on the earth. And so we have the church already being taken out, and here we'll actually see the male child again and the woman again. And so we're continuing on with this allegorical prophecy that we see that these different things represent different things, this symbolic prophecy. As we go through this passage, we're going to be seeing kind of a tale of two situations. Because part of Israel will be delivered from persecution and destruction, and the other part of Israel will actually be attacked by Satan. And so we'll see two particular parts of Israel, one being delivered, one being attacked, and we'll see the reason for that later on. And that'll come out as we get to the end in verse 17. Now, initially, when we look at verses 13 through 14, we'll see how unbelieving Israel will be delivered from persecution. Now, I say unbelieving because according to biblical prophecy, Israel will not believe as a nation until the return of Jesus Christ at the beginning of the millennial reign. If you want to research that further, you can look up Zechariah chapter 12. We've talked about that before. And Zechariah chapter 12, starting in 12 and then going through 14, that talks about the same period, especially with Israel in chapter 12 of the book of Zechariah. They will be saved in the future. Also with the book of Romans at the end of chapter 11, Israel will be saved. There's some people that believe that Israel is replaced by the church. And so if they look at a passage like this and they say, see, the church will be inside the Great Tribulation, because they say the church in the future is Israel. Israel in the future is the church. But that's not what the Bible declares. The Bible declares that they're two separate things. Israel and the church are two separate things. Later on, Israel will indeed be saved as a nation. And here we see a time before that, before they're finally saved, because Jesus hasn't come back physically to the earth to set up his kingdom. They haven't been saved yet, and so the dragon, who is Satan, and the world system that goes underneath him, will come down to this earth and will be attacking Israel and persecuting Israel. And so let's look back at verse 13. At the beginning of it says, "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth." Of course, Satan and his beings, his demons, principalities and powers, his whole system of everything, when it is finally cast down to the earth, that's a reference to in the future time during the tribulation period when he no longer has access to heaven. Now, some biblical scholars debate on when this happened, because there's a passage in the gospel accounts where Jesus talks about seeing Satan fall down from heaven. But that's not saying that's happening right then. It's a prophetic look at what will happen with Satan. Now, Satan as the head of his cadre of evil demons, the head of his group of evil demons, his evil minions, if you will, he will be cast out of heaven along with all of those who are his. At the present time, Satan has the ability, or not the ability, the allowance to enter into heaven to the presence of God, because he is ultimately responsible to God, and he cannot do anything unless God ultimately allows it to be done. That doesn't mean that God commands him to do things, but Satan can never override God's sovereign power. We see that in the book of Job. In the book of Job, Satan wants to attack Job, and he has to get approval from God before he can attack Job. Now, in that, we see God doing two things. God allows a test for Job so that Job's righteousness can be proven out and so that his faith can grow. But for Satan, he just wants to destroy Job. So in the same trial, in the same tribulation, we see two different things happening. So Satan previously has had access into the presence of God. At this time, however, he no longer has access into the presence of God. He is cast down to this earth. And so that's what we see at the beginning of verse 13. It says, now when the dragon saw that he had been cast down to the earth, so Satan leading his worldwide system, it says he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now, who's the woman again? If you remember many, many months ago, who's the woman? Israel. The woman is Israel. She's representing the nation of Israel. And she is the one who gave birth to the male. Now, in the English there, it puts in child, but notice that's in italics. For New King James, most of your Bibles puts that in italics, because it's not actually in the text. It's a editor put that in to add clarity, but that's why they put in italics, because it's referring to the male child that was born earlier in the passage. What's that male child again? Now, remember again, before, it's not Jesus, because it's not talking about a literal woman giving birth to a literal child. Remember, she's pregnant woman in the heavens, in the middle of space, and she's not giving birth to a literal child. It's talking about Israel really giving birth to the church. Now, of course, Jesus is the head of the church, but this is referring really to the church itself. And remember, the child is taken up out of the world before the dragon can attack the child. And that's a reference to the rapture of the church being taken out. Of course, the same is not true for Jesus. Jesus wasn't taken out before he could be attacked. He was crucified, then he died, then he rose again, and then he ascended up to heaven, but he wasn't escaping anyone when he ascended up into heaven. So it's not talking about Jesus, it's talking about the church. So giving us that background of what happened before. So the dragon, he's been cast down to this earth, and because he's been cast down, he says, now I'm going to attack Israel, because he's so mad, he's so angry at him being in this situation that, what can he do? The sovereignty of God. He can't overcome God. And so what's he going to do? He's going to try and attack anyone he can. Who's he going to attack? He's going to attack Israel, because he hates Israel. And it's fascinating, not fascinating, I'd say sadly fascinating to see that the whole world right now really hates Israel, except for a few nations, except for really the U.S., maybe the Philippines to some degree, a few nations in Europe, maybe you could say maybe Great Britain a little bit, but there's a lot of nations now that just really are anti-Israel. They think Israel's the worst. And it's shocking, actually, to see how many people are deluded by this. Even there was one person, I don't know how long he's going to be going to the church in Las Vegas there, Fervent, but he's been going there for a little while. And I had a chance to talk to him about at an event that we had, a family event that we had. I don't know why he was there, but he was there, and he just started talking to me about how evil Israel is. I'm like, dude, where did you get your news from? It's like, oh, CNN. I'm like, man, you don't know anything. You're watching the wrong news source. He said, Israel's starving the Palestinians, and they don't send them any food. First of all, whoever sent their enemy food in a war? Whoever does that? Has anybody ever done that in the history of the universe? No one ever sends their enemy food. But just for laughs and giggles, I took out my phone and I asked Google, which is not, it's definitely not pro-Israel. I asked Google, how much food has Israel sent Gaza since the beginning of the war? It was 1.9 million tons of food. A ton is 2,000 pounds. So 2,000 times 1.9 million, and that's how many pounds of food Israel has sent Gaza. The sad thing about it is that the Hamas, which is the terrorist group that runs Gaza, as soon as the food gets into Gaza, the terrorists steal the food and don't give it to the people. And then they report to CNN, oh, we don't have any food. The people are starving, while they have warehouses and warehouses and warehouses of food, and they're living like kings. But of course, they're letting their people suffer so that they can put it on the news that everybody in Gaza is starving. So, and it's just shocking to see how almost everyone in the world buys this false narrative and thinks Israel is just the worst. Now, Israel is a secular nation, like most nations on the earth. Are they perfect? No. But what nation is perfect? But for some reason, and of course we know why that is, all of these nations hate Israel so terribly. Of course, why is that? Because Satan is the ruler of this world, and Satan hates Israel with a passion. And during this time especially, when the dragon comes back down, Satan is the head of that the demonic hordes. When he comes back down, when they come back down, oh, they are going to do what they're going to try and do terrible things to Israel. And so we see that they are persecuted. Israel will be persecuted. But then we see something happen. In verse 14 it says, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place. Now, first of all, start off with that first part. The woman was given two wings of a great eagle. Now, obviously, this is figurative language. The woman is not a real woman. It's Israel. The wings are not really real wings. It's representative of some way that they're allowed to escape. Now, there's a lot of debate from biblical scholars what that is. Really, we don't know what that is. But there's actually a lot of people, mostly American scholars, who say, oh, that's America. Because in America, one of the symbols that American has is the bald eagle, an eagle. And so they say, oh, that's America coming to rescue Israel. And it is interesting to see that amongst the nations of the earth, only the U.S. is really on the side of Israel. There's other nations. The Philippines has always been on the side of Israel. But amongst the nations that really have a lot of military power, the U.S. is the one that's really been for Israel and helping Israel out throughout the history of the world. As long as America's been around, which is only the past 200 years. But so she's given 2 wings of a great eagle. We don't know exactly what that is, but obviously helped out somehow to escape from this persecution of Satan and his system and his world system. Now, where do they go? Look at verse 14. Where do they fly to? It says that they might fly into the wilderness to her place. Now, a lot of people think that this is the rock city of Petra, and it's possible, but it talks about them being hidden. And I don't know how they could be hidden in a place that's so well known. So I kind of wonder if it really is going to be Petra. It might be. The Lord could somehow shield it supernaturally. But as far as a place that's not well known, Petra would be a place that's very well known. And so I wonder if it might be another place in the wilderness that nobody knows about at the present time. But whatever it is, the Lord allows Israel to escape, to fly into the wilderness, as it were, so that he can protect her and nourish her. And notice what it says at the end of verse 14, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So times, so for time and times, that's singular, time, times 2, and then half a time. That's the 3.5 year period. And that's what we're really talking about here. Because at the beginning of the tribulation period, if you remember, we talked about this like 6 months ago. So if you don't remember, that's not on you. At the beginning of the tribulation period, there will be a covenant or an agreement made between the Antichrist, who Israel thinks is great at that time. They don't think he's bad at that time. And he makes a covenant. For 7 years, he says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And during that time, there's peace between Israel, between their enemies, between a whole bunch of different people, which is kind of interesting. We haven't really seen peace in the Middle East between Israel and their enemies. They've always been at war ever since their existence in early history, and even since 1948 when they've come back into the land. There's always been war. There's always been war. They've never really had a time of sustained peace in Israel between their neighbors. But during this time, the Antichrist will come along and he will make a peace, and the world will just be like, wow, how did you make that peace? At first, a couple of years ago, I think that was 2018 or 2019, I was a little bit worried because Trump had started to make all these peace agreements between Israel and the surrounding nations. I'm like, hello. But it's interesting that it didn't fully happen between all their neighbors. There's a few that signed peace agreements with Israel, but not the whole Middle East, like, because the only one to do that is the Antichrist, you know? So it's kind of just funny how that worked out. But even Trump wasn't able to make peace with all their neighbors. Some of them. Iran still attacking them, some of the other nations, Gaza, of course, the West Bank. And so thankfully, Trump's not the Antichrist. But that was kind of interesting how that worked out. It's kind of a lost cause to make peace between all the enemies of Israel. He can't make peace. Only the Antichrist will make peace with all the enemies of Israel. Only the Antichrist, until after the tribulation. And so at the beginning, he'll make this great peace. But we're told in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, that in the middle of that covenant, in the middle of the 7 periods, he'll break the peace. He'll declare that he's God in the temple. Israel will be like, that's not who we thought we were following. And they'll start to be persecuted. And this is what this is talking about, that they will flee out into the wilderness. And that's the second half of the 3.5 year of the 7-year tribulation. So the 3.5 years, the last part of the tribulation, they will be taken care of in the wilderness. Now, why would the Lord do that? Israel doesn't follow him at this present time. You go to Israel, they're just as secular as most other nations on the earth. Why is God taking them out to the wilderness and protecting them? What do you guys think? I mean, there's some people that would say that Israel is still saved because they're the people of God. Now, in a way, they're the people of God, but not in the sense that they're saved. They're the people that God chose in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we're told in chapter 11 by Paul that in reference to the gospel, they're enemies because they don't follow the gospel. They haven't believed in Jesus. But the beloved, for the sake of the promises that were given to the fathers, God made promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. He made promises even throughout the Old Testament about Israel and their future salvation. Especially the passage I mentioned a little bit earlier in Zechariah, where Zechariah prophesies that they will be saved, every single one of them, all the families of the house of Israel, at least all the families that remain. There will be some that don't remain anymore because they've died before the end of the Great Tribulation. Sad to say. They've died before even coming to the Great Tribulation. Sad to say. But all those that remain, God will save. And so why does he preserve them? Because that's what he promised to do. He promised to save them. And God doesn't go back on his promises. If you've made a mistake, if you've failed, well, thankfully, God is not faithless when we are faithless. He is still faithful. That's what the New Testament says in the book of 2 Timothy. And so the Lord takes them out to the wilderness to nourish them for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And so here in verses 13 through 14, we see that unbelieving Israel will be delivered from persecution because the Lord is good. Not because they're good, but because the Lord is good. Now looking at verses 16 through 17, we see that Israel will be delivered from destruction. So look at verse 15 again with me. It says, "So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood." Now let me ask you, is this a literal flood of water? Literal flood? What do you guys think? Well, so far we've been dealing with figurative aspects. We've been dealing with a woman that represents Israel, dragon, which represents a satanic government with Satan as the head, as well as a child that represents the church. So we're dealing with things that are not necessarily literal. The two wings, the great eagle, we don't know what that represents, but it represents something. So also this flood that's spewing out of the dragon's mouth. Usually we think about fire coming out of a dragon's mouth. In this case, it's water, right? Being spewed out of a dragon's mouth. Is that a literal flood of water? Literal water? Well, I mean, anything's possible. If the Lord really wanted it to happen that way, anything's possible. But oftentimes in the Bible, when used figuratively, water can refer to the Gentile peoples. Actually, in chapter 13, what we'll get to hopefully next week or so, we'll see that there's a beast that rises up out of the water. Also a beast that rises up out of the land. The beast out of the water will represent the Gentile peoples. So what this could represent, water spewing out in a flood, is a Gentile army pursuing Israel into the wilderness. That's possibly what it represents. A Gentile army pursuing them into the wilderness. And so it says that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Of course, Satan has always and will always want to destroy Israel, and he's going to try his best to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. But God has promised that they will be saved. So we already know the end of the story. God's promised they will be saved. And we have to always trust the Lord when he promises something. Look at verse 16. It says, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth." Okay, so we see the woman being saved. Now, literal or figurative, it's hard to determine. Here we've got a flood of water, and the earth opens up, like a crack forms, and the water goes into the crack in this figurative vision. What does that represent? It's hard to know exactly. If the water represents Gentile armies, in some way those Gentile armies are destroyed. Is it through a crack in the earth? I don't know. That could be figurative for something else as well. We don't know exactly, but in some way, the Lord stops this attack upon Israel. And that's, of course, again, because he's promised that he will deliver Israel. How frustrating would that be for Satan? You know, Satan is a very, very frustrated person, because Satan can never get what he wants. What does Satan want? He wants to kill, steal, and destroy. But he can never ultimately get what he wants. Especially when it comes to Christians, and especially when it comes to Israel, Satan cannot destroy the people of God. And so the Lord preserves them through some miraculous way. We don't know exactly what this will be, exactly how this will happen. I'm sure looking down from heaven, when we see this happen, we're like, that's what it is. That's how the Lord did that. We'll understand it perfectly looking down from heaven. But for now, it's a little bit mysterious what this is and how this comes to pass. It could be a literal flood that actually gets swallowed up literally by the earth. Or it could be an army that gets stopped and destroyed somehow. We don't know exactly. But we know the Lord preserves Israel. And so that second aspect there, verses 15 through 16, we see unbelieving Israel will be delivered from destruction. Now, lastly, in verse 17, we see that believing Israel will endure war from Satan. Like, wait a second. Unbelieving Israel gets preserved and protected, while believing Israel has to endure war from Satan? That doesn't sound fair. Is that fair? Well, we'll think about that as we go along. And actually I encourage you to think about it as we go along through this, and we'll come back to it at the end of this passage. Now in verse 17 it says, "And the dragon was enraged with the woman." Yeah, he can't get his way. He was enraged with the woman. He hates Israel so very, very much. And so what does he do in his anger and his hatred? And he went to make war with who? With the rest of her offspring? who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, who would that be? We've already seen the child, which represents the church being taken up to heaven. Who would the rest of her children be, her offspring be, who do what? Who keep the commandments of God, which shows that they're Israelites, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, which shows that they're believers. So this is a group of believing Israelites who are still on the earth at this time. Now let me ask you, so far in the book of Revelation, for those who might remember last year, who have we been introduced to so far that are Israelites and believers during this time? Do you remember? It's been quite a while, last year. We were introduced to the 144,000. And the 144,000 are 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel. We discussed that at great length back in chapter 7. Now we see that there are other offspring from the woman who is Israel, right? Who are being persecuted. And these people, they obey the commandments of God, so it seems like they're Israelites. They have that cultural tradition of being Jewish in their culture, in their traditions. And also they hold the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, interestingly enough, in chapter 14, we will see these believers once more. In chapter 7 before, they're still on earth. But in chapter 14, let me actually just take you there really quick. In chapter 14, verse 1, it says this: "Then I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the voice of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of the harpists playing on their harps before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These are redeemed from among men, being firstfruits of God, to the Lamb, and in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before God." We see them before on the earth, and they're witnesses for God. Now we see them on a heavenly Mount Zion. There's an earthly Mount Zion, but there's a heavenly Mount Zion, and eventually the two will merge as we are brought up into the new creation. But they are with God now in the heavenly Mount Zion. So what happened to them on earth? They've been redeemed from the earth. Well, it looks like Satan killed them all. There they were on the earth serving God, the 144,000, witnessing for the sake of the Lord, and Satan goes and makes war against them. But let me ask you something. Because we think, well, why would he be allowed to do that? Let me ask you something. What is death for the believer? What is death for the believer? What's that? Go home na? Is that what you say? Go home na? Death is go home na. What else? Anybody else want to add to that? What's your perspective on death? What's a good biblical perspective on death? Huh? Victory. Go home na. It's victory. I'm sure there's many other good phrases we could add to that. Like Pastor Chuck used to say, he used to say in his preachings, if ever you read in the newspaper that Pastor Chuck died, they're not telling you the truth. It should say he moved to heaven. I'm not quoting it exactly correctly, but that's the gist of it. That he moved to heaven. Go home na. That's how Paul saw it. That's how all the early believers saw it. Paul said, actually, I can't tell which is better. To be present with you, which is more needful for you. That's helpful for you. Okay, you know, at that time, especially kinahanglan gyud si Paul diha sa kalibutan. They really needed Paul on earth at that time to help with the ministry. But Paul said, I'd rather be in heaven, you know. And to the people, he's in prison. And to the people, it's like, do you want to kill me? Go ahead. I don't care. In fact, that's all of the early church leaders, the powerful martyrs throughout history. They've always had that perspective. What can you really do to me? This is just a temporary, this is a tent. but I have a building in heaven made without hands. God made it for me, a new body, a new creation in Christ Jesus, a real new physical body, a new resurrection. You can't touch that. Satan can't touch that. So what is really death to us? So we see here that these believers most likely have died. These Jewish believers have died. They got saved during the Great Tribulation, and they died at the hands of Satan. But what does that mean except a quick ticket up to heaven? That's all that means. I'm reminded again, and probably I shared this with you, one of the early church patriarchs, they were trying to convince him to denounce Christ. They told him, we have animals we can set upon you in the Colosseum. We can burn you with the flames. And he said, what, should I be more afraid of those flames or the flames of hell? Which one should I be more afraid of? And he said, go do it. Stop trying to scare me. Go do it. I don't care. I'm not going to abandon Jesus Christ. And really, what is death to us? It is nothing. Now, think about this, because, right now we live in a free society. Here in the Philippines, it's free to worship the Lord. In the U.S., it's free to worship the Lord. And thankfully, we've seen waves of almost persecution, but not quite. And then, we've seen other places in the world where there is heavy persecution. And I think that was just yesterday that there was a church that was massacred by Islamists, extreme radical Muslims. Technically, the Quran says for Muslims to kill unbelievers, to kill Christians and other people. But some people don't really follow that. Some Muslims don't follow that. But these people were radical Islamists, and they massacred a church. 49 people died. But you know what? While it's tragic, those 49 people are right now in the presence of God. They died for Christ. They died as believers in Christ. And so they're instantly in the presence of God with no more pain, no more sorrow, no more anything that is troubling on this earth. And wow, what a perspective to think of it that way. What should we be afraid of on this earth? What should we look at and say, oh God, why are you allowing that? It's a ticket to heaven. Why would God not allow it? Now that doesn't mean that we should become suicidal. That's not the Lord's will at all. But sometime, someday, and in some places, we might be called to lay down our lives for the sake of Christ, like these believers were called to do, to lay down their lives for the sake of Christ. Are we ready mentally, spiritually to do that if that should happen to us? Of course, for Israel, God didn't allow them to be destroyed. Why? Because they're not saved. Why should they die? Because they're not saved. God's going to save them eventually. Eventually they're going to believe, but right now they're not. So God's going to try and preserve them. But for these believers, they're saved. So what's the danger of dying here on this earth? And so the Lord allowed it in His sovereign will. We don't always know His purposes, but He allowed it to happen. And we see in chapter 14, we'll meet them again in chapter 14, and they will be praising God on Mount Zion, worshiping the Lord in perfect bliss. So we will see them again, even though right now they've died. So as we've looked through this passage, we can see Israel and the wrath of Satan. And especially for application today, I hope that you would go away from this message really having a faith in the Lord and His love for us and His love for saving people. And also that even though we might be persecuted and even die on this earth, that doesn't change the Lord's love for us. And we can look at persecution and we can look at death even and say, you know what? It doesn't matter because I know where I'm going in the future. I know after I die, I will be in the presence of the Lord. Amen?